Right. Good morning. You need to stand further away, John.
2 metre distancing.
2 metre distancing. Good morning and welcome to the coronavirus briefing. Now, I apologise for the 11 o'clock start. As is the want with these things, technology has been a bit haywire today, and that's not just with us. There's a whole lot of stuff going on with the phone networks and so on. So they tell us everything's working now, and I'm trusting that you can see and hear us. So we'll just turn on the clicker. Oh, hang on a minute. Right, so we're all good to go. So this is a joint presentation from Paulson Higgs and Anderson Lloyd. 3 weeks ago, John phoned me and said, "We think we should do something around COVID-19." And I went, "Yeah, I'll get on to it." And the speed and escalation of the way things have changed in the last week, and even in the last few days about this presentation, has been quite tremendous, and certainly indicates the gravity of what we're facing. So today, the batting order was meant to be this. It's been changed slightly. So we're going to start with John. He's a partner at Anderson Lloyd, and he's going to talk about the employment issues that we're all going to face. That's going to be followed by Sarah from Anderson Lloyd, another partner. She's going to talk about the contractual things, about how you get out of your leases if you need to, if someone can't supply to you but you desperately need stuff, and so on. Then we've got Henry, one of the partners at Paulson Higgs, and he's going to talk about what you should do as a business from cash flow, stock, and a lot of time on the current government subsidies and what they've put out. That's going to be followed by Tony Alexander. He's based up in Wellington, quite far out. He's on dial-up, so we're only going to get sound and no vision for him. So you'll just get to see a slide with his face. Unfortunately, that's the best we can do. And he's going to tell us something about the economic impact so far, and also he's going to look a bit further down the track to see what happens next. So that means we're going to start with your slides, John.
Indeed we are.
Which is you.
Right.
You click that to go forward.
Thank you.
Good luck and keep safe.
Thank you. So as Dave said, things have moved really rapidly, and when I prepared my slides for this last week, they were current, or as current as Saturday, but the announcement yesterday has changed everything. So I'm going to have to add lib to some of my slides, and I'll talk you through this. I've got over 29 years employment experience, and I'm needing to call on all of it because this is uncharted territory. So I'm not going to have all the answers for you, but I'm going to try to help you through some of the key questions that we've been asked. My team have been asked over the last few days and over the weekend, advising people. So the starting point is the legislation. There have been to date no amendments to the key legislation, so we're stuck within that, the existing framework that we know: the Employment Relations Act, the Holidays Act, Health and Safety at Work Act, the Parental Leave and Employment Protection Act, and I'll talk to you about that in terms of consultation. If you're proposing redundancies and restructuring, you have a heightened obligation to consult with people not in the workplace, and I'm going to extrapolate that out to people on sick leave as well as parental leave, people self-isolating, which is going to be all of us soon, but people working remotely. You're going to have to be very careful with that you do the best that you can to consult when you're proposing wholesale changes. Wages Protection Act, and I'm talking about the minimum wage order as well, which will be relevant if you're wanting to, by agreement, negotiate reductions in payment for your staff. So Section 100, sorry, I'll go back one. Overriding provisions are the duty of good faith. And there's two relevant bits I just want to refer to. The first is that you need to be active and constructive in establishing and maintaining a productive and employment relationship. And that includes being responsive and communicative. It's not going to change because of this climate, but your timeframes and the extent to which you communicate will change, but you still need to use your best endeavours to communicate and be responsive and try to maintain that employment relationship. And I'm sure all employers out there will be doing that. And the other aspect that you need to consider is that when you're proposing to make a decision that will or is likely to have an adverse effect, you actually have to give the employee information and an opportunity to comment. And again, the time frame can be truncated, but you can't just jump through or miss that step out. Section 103A is the test of what can be justified in terms of an employer's actions, and that is basically what a fair and reasonable employer could have done in all the circumstances. That's a legal speak. I suppose the better way of picturing it is if you put yourself in the position of the employee who has responsibility and for the livelihood of their family, ask yourself, how would you like to be treated in the circumstances? And I think if you do that honestly, you're going to satisfy the test of what a fair and reasonable employer could have done in all the circumstances. The court is going to have regard to the resources available to the employer when considering whether the employer sufficiently investigated the allegations against the employee before dismissing or taking action. My view is that that test and the resources of the employer will also apply to restructuring and redundancy. So you need to explore alternatives and to consult, and your ability to explore and to enact alternatives will depend on your resources. So the bigger you are, the better resourced you are, the higher the onus, and a little one-person operator is not going to have the same onus on them. Whether or not you've given the employer a reasonable opportunity to respond will also be proportionate to your resources, and whether you've genuinely considered the employee's explanation will be proportionate to your resources and also how quickly you need to move. So a larger employer with a big balance sheet and decent borrowings off the bank is not going to have to move as quickly in terms of redundancies as a small operator with no cash flow. And that's the sort of, in my view, that's the sort of analysis that if we end up in litigation further down the line, the court and the Employment Relations Authority are going to look at. So, variations to your employment agreement. My view is that with the exception of minimum statutory entitlements such as sick leave, 5 days sick leave, 4 weeks annual leave, and minimum wage, employers and employees can agree almost anything, including variations to their current employment agreement. So the starting point is always going to be, what does the employment agreement and the policies and procedures actually say? So you need to know them before you can start varying them. Going to turn now to Leave and the Holidays Act. Again, this is probably an area where yesterday's announcement's overtaken things, because basically, with the exception of essential services, businesses will from midnight tomorrow be in shutdown. But I'll just talk you through these, and they may be relevant to your business. So you can't contract out of minimum requirements in the Holidays Act, even with the employee's consent. So for argument's sake, an employee who has 4 weeks annual leave cannot agree with you to go down to 1 week's annual leave, and you can't agree to less than their sick leave requirement. What you can't also agree to give less than 14 days notice of a requirement to take annual leave, but you can agree with your employee that they waive that requirement for notice and that they, in conjunction with you, agree to take their annual leave immediately or on short notice. It's only if they don't agree that you then need to give them 14 days notice of your requirement for them to take their annual leave. So just a quick summary: annual holidays, the statutory minimum 4 weeks after the end of each completed 12-month period of continuous employment. Sick leave, 5 days after each 12-month period. You qualify after 6 months of current continuous employment. Bereavement leave, and unfortunately, this leave is going to become more prevalent as we experience our first deaths in this country. So it's something that probably most employers don't have a lot of experience with, but 3 days for each 12-month period of continuous employment after the employee again has completed 6 months of continuous current employment. Annual leave, the employer must give an employee not less than 14 days notice of the requirement. I've spoken about that. When annual holidays are to be taken, however, can be agreed by the employer and the employee, but the employer must not unreasonably withhold consent to the employee's request. And then once granted, an employer cannot withdraw that leave without the employee's agreement. Now, you might think that this is odd when we're thinking that we're going to not need our employees, but coming out the other side, people who have been granted leave or deferred leave, we might need all hands on deck. And it's then that you will need to turn your mind to these sort of considerations. Close down periods. Close down periods are where an employer customarily closes its operations. You can only have one close down period permitted in any 12-month period, and there's no legislative changes to that signalled at the moment. But the Act doesn't prevent an employer and an employee from agreeing that the employer may close its operations and discontinue the work of the employee at other times and on arrangements that will apply during those times. So this is going to be a crucial tool to employers where they just don't see that there's any work moving forward, but they don't want to lose their key employees. And so what they can do is agree with the employee that they will discontinue operations. Employees will take leave without pay, but employees will remain employees during that time. And when things ramp up again, as they inevitably will, you can then resume your operations and have your employees come back. An employer can have different close down periods for each part of the business, and there has to be 14 days notice of a requirement to take annual leave or to discontinue work during that close down period. Annual leave options, you can agree to an employee taking annual leave in advance of their entitlements. So even though they don't have it in stock, if you want to, you can allow them to take it, and then they will effectively have less when times become busy, which could be to your advantage if you're wanting all hands on the deck. An employee may request an employer to pay out a maximum of 1 week in each entitlement year, but the employer can't require an employee to be paid out. So again, you might think that's odd. Who wants to be paying out in this time a year, an entitlement year? But if your employee actually asks for that, that might be to your advantage again when you get busy and the employee has less leave and therefore more productive time for you. On the other side of this, employer may allow employee to take annual leave if sick leave or a bereavement leave is exhausted, and an employer may also allow an employee taking annual leave to change it to sick leave if they've been unwell while on annual leave. And then an employer must allow an employee to take who's in the process of taking annual holidays to change that to bereavement leave if there's a bereavement suffered on an annual leave. And that situation is going to occur. So where you have run out of work for your employees and you've got them using up their annual leave by agreement and they suffer a bereavement, then that will need to change to bereavement leave. And bereavement leave and sick leave, again, recall, apply to partners when partners and dependents are sick or become injured or suffer a bereavement. So I'll just move on to sick leave. Sick leave is for when employees are sick or injured, where their spouse, partner or dependent are sick or injured, and the employee must notify the employer of their intention as early as possible. And if that's not practicable, and I think in a lot of situations you're going to find that's not practicable, then it's as early as possible after that time. Employees can carry up to 15 days leave over to a maximum of 20 days, and sick leave is not paid out. So a number of agreements allow for greater accumulation of sick leave, and the employer is obliged to honour that minimum of 20 days current entitlement, but in my view, you can agree with your employee to reduce entitlements greater than the statutory minimum. Bereavement leave, it's where an employee suffers a bereavement, and I've spelt that out there: spouse or partner, parent, child, brother or sister, grandparent, grandchild, spouse or partner's parent. But then there's also on the death of any other person if the employer accepts that the employee has suffered a bereavement as a result of death. So that is up to the employer to accept the employee's claim, and closeness of association between the employee and the deceased person, whether or not they've taken significant responsibility for them, for the ceremonies, cultural responsibilities, they're all factors that the employer needs to take into account. Family violence leave is something that probably won't occur to a lot of people because it's new, and my experience is that not many people have been taking up on that. But where someone has exhausted their sick leave and where they've exhausted their annual leave, you might find that they are making claims for family violence leave because that's another 10 days of pay for them. The other thing that runs in tandem with that is that the anecdotal experience from family court practitioners is that during Christmas time, there is a whole lot more domestic violence because families who aren't accustomed to being at home together are suddenly put into a cauldron, and that often results in, along with financial pressure from Christmas spending, results in more domestic violence. Well, that's exactly the situation, unfortunately, that we're going to have over the next 4 weeks with schools shut and self-isolation. So previous advice would have been, I would be loath to advise an employer to require proof of domestic violence when asking, or family violence when asking for family violence leave. But where you may find you're having an increasing precedence of people claiming domestic or family violence leave, then you are actually entitled to ask for proof of that. And that can be a medical certificate or anything similar. And there's no hard and fast definition on what proof of family violence is. So it will be for each employer to make that assessment in good faith. Health and Safety and Work Act is going to be relevant for a number of you. So I'm just going to quickly go through the responsibilities. Much of this, again, was prepared on the basis that employers were going to be open. It's now going to be particularly relevant to those who meet the essential services category and are able to remain open. It's not going to be so relevant to those of you who have had to shut down. It will be relevant, though, to you who have workers working from home because you still have health and safety obligations to them. So you have to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers while at work. And I'll come to what work is in a moment. And workers whose activities in carrying out work are influenced or directed by the employer while the workers are carrying out work. So if your site has some influence, then you have to be cognizant of that influence on other workers. Employer must, so far as is reasonably practicable, ensure the health and safety of other persons is not put at risk from work carried out as part of the employer's conduct. So this means not only workers, but other employers' workers, where they are influenced or directed by you and other persons potentially affected by the work that you carry out. So far as reasonably practicable includes a safe work environment, safe systems at work, safe use and handling and storage of substances, provision of adequate facilities for welfare of workers at work, provision of information, training and instructional supervision that's necessary to protect all persons from risks to their health and safety. So that means updating your workers in relation to Ministry of Health and government initiatives in terms of coronavirus, and then monitoring of the health and workers and conditions at workplace for the purposes of preventing injury and workers. So adequate facility for welfare of workers will now be something that employers have to focus on given physical distancing policies. And so essential services are allowed to operate, but you're going to have to look at how you can distance people, split shifts maybe. All those type of considerations need to be given weight. And there's also the obligation to provide information and training, as I've mentioned. That monitoring of health of workers and conditions at the workplace for the purposes of preventing injury and illness, that is going to become particularly prevalent where you've got people working from home under work pressure, but who have family also putting them under pressure, and husbands and partners who are also under pressure. So you're going to have to touch base with your workers. You're going to have to touch base to check that their equipment is up to scratch, that their workplace conditions at home are up to scratch. Again, it's not an absolute test. The test is what is reasonably practicable, and that will be a moving feast in this fluid environment. Workplace includes a place where work is being carried out or is customarily carried out, but it also includes any place where a worker goes or is likely to be while at work. Workers' accommodation that's owned by or under the management of or control of the employer and where occupancy is necessary. Vehicles, aircraft, ships necessary for employment. You're going to need to consider all of those and your health and safety obligations in relation to those. Control of the workplace. An employer who manages or controls the workplace must, again, so far as reasonably practicable, ensure the workplace and the means of entering and exiting the workplace and anything arising from the workplace are without risks to health and safety of any person. So what we're really talking about there are maybe your contractors, your suppliers coming onto your site. You have health and safety obligations to them, as do their own employers. Employees also have responsibilities, and so this is important for your employees working from home or working in remote locations. They have to take reasonable care for their own health and safety. They have to take reasonable care that their own actions and omissions don't adversely affect the health and safety of others. They have to comply as far as reasonably able with any reasonable instruction given, and they have to cooperate with any reasonable policy or procedure relating to health or safety at the workplace. So an example I can give in giving advice yesterday was a workplace with a number of employees, 70 years plus, who don't want to go home, and the employer was saying, well, what can we do? And my advice to them was, given the directive yesterday that, just prior to yesterday, that 70-year-olds are to self-isolate and be at home, if they don't want to, then I think that an employer can, in complying with its health and safety obligations, require them to do so. And so that's an example of complying with your workers, your employer's instructions, and an obligation to cooperate with any reasonable policy. And where the government has given an initiative or a directive, then that is hardly going to be anything other than a reasonable policy. Duty of other persons at the workplace. A person at a workplace must take reasonable care of their own health and safety. So again, that's your contractor coming on site, your supplier coming on site. Take reasonable care that their acts or omissions do not adversely affect the health and safety of other persons. And again, they also have to comply with any reasonable instruction that's given by the entity in control of the workplace. So if it's your workplace, they have to comply with your instructions and your health and safety policies. So a number of you will be racking your brains now about what alternatives we can implement before we have to look at restructuring and redundancy. So I've just got some examples here. You all know your businesses better than I know them, so you need to put your thinking caps on. Don't underestimate the options that your own employees may be able to come up with. We're all in this together, and this is time to collaborate. This is time for us to work with the unions and to work together so that we can come up with solutions and innovations that will bring us through this. So you can reduce wages and salary by agreement. Again, you can't go below the minimum wage. You can reduce hours by agreement. You can reduce days of work. We'll all remember the GFC and the 4-day working week. That was by agreement with employees as an alternative to redundancy. We can redeploy people into different positions by agreement. We can agree to them taking a period of leave without pay by agreement. Access to government subsidies, don't forget that. And Henry's going to speak on that, but I'm happy also to answer any questions on that, because that's probably at the moment, the most questions that we are getting in our employment team is, how do we qualify for the subsidy? What does normal income mean? What does self-isolating leave involve? What are the qualifications for that? I think the answer to that last question, even though the government is saying that from tomorrow we all need to be at home unless we're an essential service, that doesn't qualify you for self-isolating leave. It's only if you are required to self-isolate by the Ministry of Health guidelines. Also look at accessing workers from other heavily affected regions such as Queenstown. So for example, advising a client the other day who had a number of immigrant workers coming from Samoa, suddenly they were cancelled. They have a whole deficiency of workforce for fruit picking. There's the Southern District Health Board in our region is advertising for people even to do mundane tasks such as couriering people around, wheeling trolleys around. There's going to be all sorts of opportunities for other workers. So think about those options. Workplace, sorry, wrong slide. Other considerations. For some reason, I've lost my other slide. So I will take you through the slide that's missing. The other options I had included secondment, giving consideration to secondment, collaborative employer approaches across sectors, so in industry. So I know that the meatworks are cooperating together and looking at how they can cross-resource each other and share workload and share employees even. Considering varying your current permanent employment agreements to fixed-term employment agreements or even casual employment agreements. Again, it requires consent of your worker, but they may be willing to do that as an alternative to redundancy. Consider working from home. Consider varying or releasing any restraints of trade that prevent people from secondary businesses setting up their own secondary business if you can't continue to employ them full-time. Consider varying or removing any prohibitions on secondary employment that may be in your employment agreements. We all need workers moving forward, and we need to keep our key employees. So you need to focus on who are your key employees and what can you do if you can't give them full-time employment to keep them interested and from drifting, because the minute you make them redundant, they're not going to have any loyalty to your business. Whereas if they're on leave without pay and you're keeping in communication with them, then you have a chance of retaining them when times get busy. So working from home considerations, obviously workplace ergonomics, home computer security, your IT people will be thinking about that. We're all going to find out very quickly how broadband speed affects us. As you see, we've had some technical difficulties here today, and the Paulson Higgs IT system, which I've worked on before, has proven to be very reliable. So I'm suspecting that the high volume has had an impact on us today. Your health and safety obligations and directions, make sure that your employees are responsible for inspecting their own workplace. That's not just as simple as a good workstation. Expect your workers to get up during the day and make themselves a cup of coffee. Expect your workers to get up during the day and go to the toilet. Are there passageways clear of obstructions? These are the sort of things that you will now no longer have an opportunity to go and get inspected yourself. You are entitled as you've seen from my health and safety slides, to shift that responsibility to the worker and have them report back to you. If you're making those inquiries, then in my view, you are at least using your best endeavours to discharge your obligations. Don't forget to monitor the emotional well-being of your workers. And for those of you that have EAP assistance, remind your workers of that. If you don't, make sure that your supervisors are touching base with your employees from time to time. If you can monitor the hours they're working, do so, because a number of workers out there are going to be, there's going to be significant demand over the short term. And with everyone's work ethic, you're going to find people working huge hours, and you need to be communicating and keeping an eye on that. You also need to be aware that where possible, you need to provide the workplace equipment. And again, as I've mentioned before, be aware of the impact of workplace pressures. As I said, there's anecdotal evidence of family violence during Christmas periods when families are together. So I won't dwell on that anymore. Documenting the changes. While you all have to move quickly, what I'm suggesting is that it's important, if you are agreeing to a variation, to document it. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive contract. All it needs to be is an agreement on a piece of paper saying, I agree that I've had an opportunity to take advice, and I've agreed that in the circumstances that my employers explained to me, I'm going to take my annual leave rather than leave without pay. I recommend that you have it signed and dated by both parties and witnessed, and an opportunity at very least for them to take legal advice, and that should be, in my view, be recorded in the agreement or the documentation as well. So we look at redeployment and redundancy for those businesses who can't enact or can't use the alternatives that I've suggested. So consider the alternatives first. Redundancy or redeployment in this context, consultation is still required, but in my view, you can work to a truncated time frame. You still need a sound rationale. You can't just say, I'm going to make you redundant because of coronavirus. You need to do a business analysis and see whether or not you really do need to disestablish positions, or whether you can redeploy them, or whether you can keep going for some period of time, whether you can qualify for the subsidy. All those options need to be considered. But if you do decide after doing that analysis that you need to, or you think you need to go with redundancies, redeployment, then you need to spell out that rationale, and you need to also consider redeployment before finally disestablishing positions. I just wanted to talk quickly about persons intending to work. So we're having a number of inquiries from people who have signed up employees to start on an employment agreement, and there's now no work, and they're wanting to know from me, can we just simply ring them and say, sorry, you haven't started, we don't want you to start, sorry, but goodbye. The answer is no, because the minute that an employment agreement has been entered into, you are a person intending to work, and that is an employee under the definition of the Employment Relations Act. So what that requires someone intending, an employer intending to disestablish a person who hasn't even started to do, is to talk to them about, on the basis that effectively their position is going to be disestablished. The flip side of that is if the employee intending to start work cannot do so because of self-isolation, etc. And in that case, then they're not an employee that is willing and ready and able to work, and so you may be able to negotiate a mutual end to the employment relationship. If you can't do that though, and you are proposing to disestablish their position, then consultation is required, and you may well find that you're going to have to pay out their notice period. However, you know, the flip side of that is if they can't work out their notice period, then maybe you aren't obliged to pay them out. Again, consult with them in good faith. Most people, I think, in the circumstances will understand the employer's dilemma there. So looking to the future, our future, we will come out the other side of this. We're humans, we are resilient, we are innovative, and we've been through worse than this. There will then be, when we come out the other side, a rapid need to respond to demand. Have you retained your key workers? What are the options that you've considered for continuing employment relationships? And that's pretty much my presentation. I'm just having a look about the cues I've been asked. I've had a request to talk about ready, willing and able to work, meaning in the context of alert level 4 and obligation to pay, and how many businesses are paying even if staff don't have the ability to work from home. So quite a bit in there, and I thank one of my colleagues, my business partners, for asking that curler of a question. So ready, willing and able means that the employee is willing to come to work, but the employer is saying, I don't want you at work. I think with level 4, that's going to be relatively rare. So for essential services, if you have, if you're able to continue and your workers are ready, willing and able to work, but for some reason you decide that you don't want them there, then in my view, you have an obligation to pay them. If they don't want to come into work, then in my view, unless there's a genuine health and safety reason justifying them not coming into work, and an extreme example is you are working but you're flouting the 2-metre rule and you're saying, we want you in to work, and you're saying, no, I'm not going to abide by that workplace because there's not the 2-metre rule. In that situation, then the worker is justifiably entitled not to come into work, and I think that the employer in that situation would be required to pay them again. In situations such as most of us are facing, where we have workers who now have to self-isolate from tomorrow night, those that can work from home, there aren't going to be issues. Those that can't work from home, it's going to be for each individual employer to consider what their options are. A bigger resourced employer can keep their employees on the book for some period of time, ask them to take annual leave while they apply for subsidies, while they look at redeployment, while they look at other sources of work. But at some stage, if the work runs out, if the leave runs out, then you're going to have to look again by agreement with your employee about them taking leave without pay. You can't impose on an employee a unilateral change to their employment agreement. So if their employment agreement entitles them to 40 hours work, and for the circumstances you can't provide that work, you can't tell them that they need to take leave without pay. You have to have that discussion with them, but of course the alternative to them agreeing to take leave without pay is that you might then have to disestablish their position, and that might be a more permanent and more drastic consequence for them than taking leave without pay, arguably for 2 to 3 weeks that we're being asked to shut down. I don't know that I've covered, I'm sure I haven't covered all of the questions that you will have, but I'll keep answering them as they come up until I get told it's my time. Being asked a question about force majeure clauses in employment agreements. They vary and depend on their own individual wording. We had a look at the case law on this, and our view is that they don't unfortunately give you a whole lot more wriggle room than if you don't have one in place. So a force majeure does not excuse your obligations to consult in good faith and your obligations to be a fair and reasonable employer. So you're going to need to go out and say to your employee, we believe we have a force majeure situation. We believe our clause entitles us to immediately end the employment or cease the employment or halt the employment and receive their feedback on that. Some clauses will say in those situations, we will not pay you, or we won't pay you notice of that. You're going to have to look at your own individual clauses and take advice on those. But our default position is that a force majeure clause is probably the same as a redundancy clause. It's probably the same as a medical termination clause. You still have to adopt fair procedure and consultation. And again, that answer was prepared prior to yesterday's announcement. Whether or not, prior to yesterday, we would have said that probably it hadn't met a force majeure threshold. After yesterday, I'm probably undecided. I think we might be getting pretty close for a number of businesses to force majeure, but I don't think it changes your circumstances or your obligations to consult. Another question, for those over 70 told to stay away from work, can we state that they need to use sick pay, or do we just have to pay them? So two schools of thought on that. Sick pay under the Act, I've given you in the slides the definition. It's where you're sick or injured or a dependent is sick or injured. So strictly speaking, if they don't meet that criteria, you can't tell them they have to use sick pay. Having said that, we've seen MBIE's advice that you can consider agreeing employees to take sick pay. My view is, if MB is saying it, then you're probably going to be on safe grounds. What you do need to consider coming out the other side again is if you've allowed your employees to use up all their sick pay and they're back at work and then they're genuinely sick, they could well come to you and say, well, hold on, we used our sick pay when we weren't really sick because of the government's requirement to self-isolate, and now we're genuinely sick. It's really unfair that you're not giving us sick leave. So that's a consideration I think you need to take into account. Another question, for those choosing to stay away because they are immunosuppressed, do they have to use sick leave or do they just get paid their regular pay? Again, I think the answer is probably the same. They don't arguably meet the definition of being sick or injured. It's more that they have a condition, but by agreement with you, you could allow them to take their sick leave or their sick pay for that situation. I'm just looking at Dave and seeing if he wants me to continue or whether we're ready for our next presenter.
You said?
Yeah, you want me to continue or next presenter?
We've got Sarah's waiting to go.
Okay. So, look, I hope that's been of assistance to you out there. Our team, I have a team of 9 around the country on this at the moment. We know that we're going to be working as businesses need. You will also, a number of you will have your own advisors. Speaking for the employment lawyers amongst us, we'll all be ready to make ourselves available subject to our family commitments after hours, because this is unprecedented and we care about our businesses. So don't hesitate to get in touch with your own advisors if you have business specific questions, and don't hesitate to get in touch with me or my team. And thanks very much, and go well, look after yourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, John. So now we're going to be joined by Sarah. Sorry, that make you a wee bit car sick. Sarah and the lovely Lily, which is our new normal, working from home and so on. So we'll just return. Right. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies for Lily's presence. She was asleep when we were going to be doing this at 10 a.m, but she isn't now, so we're hoping she doesn't squeal. So the focus of my session is just going to be a short session on how business contracts are affected by COVID-19. If you think about contracts, they're a key part of doing business. They govern your relationship with your suppliers, your relationship with your customers, your relationship with others. And I should clarify, when I talk about contracts today, I'm not just talking about written signed contracts. I'm meaning both written and unwritten contracts. So an agreement between 2 parties doesn't need to be recorded in writing for it to be legally binding. So because of COVID-19 and because of the government orders, some businesses aren't able to comply with their contracts, or they're finding it hard to do so. If a business can't comply with its contracts, then it might try to look at ways to kind of get out of its obligations, or perhaps to get out of the contract entirely. So the focus of the session is going to be 2 potential ways where you might look to suspend or to end your obligations under the contract, and that's with force majeure clauses. So some contracts include a force majeure clause, which can operate kind of as a commercial lifeline for a business which, because of the pandemic, can't meet its contractual obligations. If you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract, then you might be able to rely upon the doctrine of frustration to get out of the contract. Alternatively, perhaps the other party to the contract might be able to use that doctrine to get out of your contracts. So it's really important to have a good understanding of these contractual rights, and that might give you leverage kind of to negotiate a solution to the problems that you're facing because of the pandemic. I'm also going to touch on some other practical considerations. So first of all, force majeure clauses. So as I said, some contracts include a force majeure clause and some don't. If you do have one, it can operate as a lifeline to get you out of having to comply with some of the obligations if the requirements in that clause are met. So what is a force majeure clause? I've put here the Wikipedia definition. If you look at it, kind of the common understanding of a force majeure clause is about freeing a party from liability or freeing them from an obligation because an extraordinary event has prevented them from fulfilling their obligations. So that's the Wikipedia definition, but under New Zealand law, force majeure doesn't have kind of a settled, independent or recognised meaning. Instead, it's vital to kind of, you have to assess the specific wording of the clause in your contract to work out when the force majeure clause does offer you protection and when it doesn't. So do you have a force majeure clause? Step number one, you've got to check your contract. Grab that contract out of the bottom drawer. Hopefully you can find your contract. You need an express clause. So courts won't imply a force majeure clause into a contract. Just a slide there. Compare that with some other jurisdictions. Like in China, there's actually a law that lets parties out of contracts in the event of a force majeure event. Whereas in New Zealand, we don't have that. So basically, if you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract, you're not going to be able to argue force majeure. If you're dealing with an overseas party, it's really important to check the governing law of your contract as well. So we mentioned how the law is different in China. It might be that if you're dealing with an overseas party, that when you look at your contract, it's not actually governed by New Zealand law, and so your New Zealand legal advisors aren't able to help you. There'll be different positions under different laws. The next step is to analyse the clause in your contract, if you do have one, to work out whether it excuses you from a breach of contract or not. Got my helper with me. So the specific wording in the contract is important. So you want to review and carefully analyse the exact meaning of that clause. You know, which events does it cover? Is it going to cover this pandemic or the government order or not? So usually it does. We've been asked to advise a number of clients on force majeure clauses in their contracts, and often a pandemic or a government order is caught by the wording in the force majeure clause, but sometimes it's not. So sometimes the clause might not talk about events beyond a party's reasonable control, or it might not expressly list a pandemic. And so in that situation, although you have a force majeure clause, it might not give any relief. And then the other thing to check is, does it apply for both parties' benefits or just for one party's benefit? So some force majeure clauses are worded so that they only benefit one party to the contract and not the other. It might say the supplier is excused from relying on the contract if there's a force majeure event. The next step in your analysis is to consider, was the breach of contract here caused by the pandemic or by the government order? So it's not enough that it's become difficult to meet your contractual obligations. You need to show a link between the pandemic and the breach of contract. So as I say, it's not enough that it's simply become more difficult or more expensive to perform the obligations under the contract. Normally the wording in the force majeure clause will require it to be kind of impossible legally or physically to perform the contract. And often the clause will say, you know, you need to have been taking reasonable steps to try and meet your obligations as well to be able to rely on the clause. So I can't caution enough, it's before you start firing off force majeure letters saying we've breached the contract, but we're claiming this is a force majeure event and we're excused from the breach, to carefully analyse the wording in the contract to make sure that it does apply. And then if it does apply, the next thing is to consider what steps do you need to take to be able to rely on that clause. So often there are contracts that say you need to give written notice to the other party within 10 business days of the force majeure event occurring, or something like that. So there'll be some steps that you need to take to follow to get relief under the force majeure clause. And just a caution, you're only excused from liability for that breach. You still need to comply with all the other obligations in the contract. What happens if you receive a force majeure notice? So if you get one from a supplier or from a customer where they're saying, look, we're in breach and the reason is because of force majeure, obviously you want to dig out your contract and check the clause and check that yes, it does apply in the circumstances at hand. I've had two situations where clients have received a force majeure notice, and then when we looked at the contract in question, there wasn't actually a force majeure clause in it, so the notice was worthless. You know, some people are kind of saying, oh, this is a force majeure event, using it in kind of that Wikipedia kind of layman's terms without actually considering it in terms of the contract. If the other party does have a force majeure clause in the contract for their benefit, you know, you want to be requesting regular updates. You know, are their supply chain issues improving? When do you think they'll be able to reopen their business? Thanks for your comment, Joe. Just trying to juggle the baby. So frustration, the doctrine of frustration might be able to help you if you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract. So the doctrine of frustration is that if you don't have a force majeure clause, what it comes down to is that essentially because of some event, that's no fault of either party, the event has made performance of the contract impossible or radically different. If there has been frustration, then the whole contract will be at an end. But it's actually very difficult to prove. So this is one that you want to talk to your legal advisors before firing off a notice saying, we think the contract is frustrated and at an end. So being in breach of a contract obviously is not an ideal situation to be in. And it's important to remain proactive and to think of practical ways through it. This might mean resorting to your legal remedies like the force majeure clause or like frustration like we just discussed, or it might mean trying to negotiate a solution. And so having a good understanding of your contractual rights means that you know what the fallback position is. It might give you leverage to negotiate a better solution. Ideally, you'd be proactive in your negotiations, that you want to try and negotiate a solution before you're actually in breach. So instead of waiting for the breach to happen. And that's especially the case for financing arrangements. So if you think you're going to be in breach of your banking covenants, get in touch with the bank sooner rather than later, especially before that breach. Just a caution on banking arrangements, often there's a material adverse change clause in your loan agreements, financing arrangements. So the material adverse change clause might have already been triggered. The bank might already consider that you've had a material adverse change to your business. So worth talking to your bankers sooner rather than later. So if you are able to negotiate a change to your contract, it might be that the solution is a variation to the contract, or perhaps a waiver, a formal waiver of a breach of contract. For both of these things, we want to get them recorded in writing. Indeed, some contracts say that a variation or a waiver is only effective if it's in writing and signed. But you know, at the very least, you want to have an email exchange recording what's been agreed with the other party. When I say getting a variation agreement signed, this doesn't actually require wet ink on a physical bit of paper. So under New Zealand law, an electronic signature will be considered just as valid as a written signature for almost all documents and for almost all legal requirements. There's some exceptions to that, like wills and affidavits, but generally an electronic signature and emails are fine, which is great in this time of minimising physical contact. Oh, just another slide. Okay, so in terms of practical considerations, the reality is that many businesses are facing challenging times at the moment in the current circumstances, and so when you're negotiating changes, there really is, you need to be mindful of the risk of your supplier or your customer becoming insolvent. So have a think as well about reputational risks. So how will the decisions that you make now be viewed down the track? How will they be viewed by the community? And be mindful of the importance of long-term relationships. So that was all that I was intending to cover in my session. So I sign off now before this turns to custard and hand back over to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lily. If there's any consolation, Lily was dead quiet for the 20 minutes you were waiting to come in, wasn't she? As is always the way. So we're very much making men today that make this happen for you, and you appreciate we live in difficult times. What I forgot to mention at the start, unfortunately, the medical officer of health, he was due to join us today, and he wasn't even defeated by technology, just events overtook him and he's unable to join us. I'm not going to pretend to give you advice on medical issues or anything. Essentially, go to, he suggested you go to covid19.gov.nz. That's got everything you'll need to know. So that brings us to Henry, and we just need to flip forward to his part of the presentation. Forward, working frame.
Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thanks, David. We shouldn't be touching this thing. We should be cleaning it between presentations.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Sarah, for what she's just prepared and presented. What a trooper. So I guess from my perspective, I'm going to cover off on three things today. And when David talked about putting this presentation together 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was thinking about what it might look like and how the presentation might work. Because I'm jumping up and down. Thanks, David.
Maybe a good height.
Yeah. And I was thinking I'll probably just talk about business continuity rather than talking about COVID-19, because I thought that, you know, is it really going to be a big effect to us, and is it really going to have an impact? It's probably more going to be a theory, and this will be a generic sort of talk. Well, how wrong was I, and how things have changed? So even now, since putting these slides together late last week, things have changed again, and things will change again today, and things are constantly changing. So some of the stuff that I might cover on, you might think is a little bit moot or not really relevant as we stand today, but we'll work through that. So really, what I thought I would do from a business continuity perspective or a business advisory perspective was to think about what others are doing, and that's a little bit out of date now, just to give a bit of a feel for what's happening around the world. The government assistance package, and certainly that still remains relevant, and we've had some updates to that yesterday, and I've updated some of the presentation to reflect those changes. And then looking at some business strategies about how to manage recession times. And again, some of those business strategies probably are designed for times that perhaps aren't quite as extreme as the times we find ourselves in now, but still are relevant and still worth talking about. Paulson Higgs as an organisation is part of a worldwide alliance, and it's called the Leading Edge Alliance, and we get a lot of correspondence and we get a lot of sharing of information between the members of that alliance, and those conversations and that information sharing is always good on a technical basis, but it's also been good at this time to see what others around the world have been doing, and we've been getting a lot of feedback daily from all over the world. And I put some of the feedback on the slide just to give an idea of where others were at and what they were doing. And as I've said, it's all a bit dated now because we're pretty much caught up and maybe surpassed a lot of these places. But you'll see in countries like Lithuania, they've had full quarantine. So others have in the States, some have worked from home, some have then moved to 100% from home. Italy, the government, the unions and businesses signed some protocols for workforce measures, so they got pretty structured and agreed in what they would do. Things in France moved along, and in Asia, some of our firms there had some pretty compulsory things to do with their staff, but as of now, we're all pretty much working from home, so some of the workplace measures are no longer particularly relevant. What did we do as a firm? And again, when I put this together, this is what we did on Friday as Paulson Higgs, and again, it's dated and it's not particularly relevant, but as a firm, we went through a process of making sure our staff could work remotely. We trialled it last Wednesday with 11 staff. We took some feedback on Thursday. We had another trial on Friday with a further 10 staff. And then from Monday, we were planning to give our staff yesterday the option from working from home. So again, all that forward planning was pretty crucial and pretty important, because we've learned from that process that, hey, we can work from home. And as much as possible, we've got business as usual carrying on. So that's good. And it says at the office at the bottom, what we told our staff is the office will remain open at present. Well, as of today, the office is closed, but as I say, we are working remotely. Moving on then to the government assistance program that was announced last week, and the cornerstone of that government assistance is the wage subsidy scheme. By far, it's the most significant dollar value and the most significant piece of support to business. So when it was originally introduced a week ago, it was projected to cost 5.1 billion. Yesterday, when it was tweaked and changed, it's reforecast to cost 9.3 billion. So a very significant piece of government assistance. It's for employers, but it's also for contractors, sole traders and self-employed. So it basically covers all aspects of the workforce from an employment side or a self-employment side. Very quickly go through the rules, because you'll be pretty much aware of a lot of the stuff already. A full-time employee is entitled to $585.80 a week, working more than 20 hours a week. A staff member who works less than 20 hours a week is deemed to be part-time, and they're entitled to $350 per week. It covers a 12-week period. So for a full-time employee, just over $7,000 is available in subsidies. For a part-time employee, $4,200 in subsidies. The key change to this as of yesterday was that the maximum for the employers to claim it was 150,000. That cap has been removed. And there's been a little bit of guidance around some of that as well, because if applications have been put in to date for a full application that was greater than 150,000, there's no need to reapply. That will be dealt with. But if there was an application put in up to 150,000, but your entitlement was greater, you can now apply for that increased amount. So the only once bit sort of applies, but doesn't, if that makes sense. The key part of this, and that's the only key part, and this applies to all businesses, whether you're an essential service or not, whether your staff can work from home or not. If you've suffered or if you have suffered or you are projected to suffer a 30% drop in revenue for 1 month between January 2020 and June 2020, you're entitled to claim the wage subsidy scheme. That criteria caused some issues for new businesses, for example, also businesses who were experiencing rapid growth, and also businesses that had forward contracts that were cancelled. So as of yesterday, some of those rules have been relaxed a bit, and some of the minister's wording also certainly recognises now that everything is COVID-19 related, essentially. So that was the test. I mean, the test now for the next 4 weeks as we go into a period of lockdown, well, without question, anything in that period is COVID-19 related. And 30% drop in revenue is the key, is really the key thing to prove. And once you can prove that, so it's either actual for time that's passed or it's projected to the end of June, you go ahead and make your application. You've got to also declare that you're going to keep your staff employed, or your best endeavours to keep staff employed at a minimum of 80% of their normal hours during that subsidy period. Again, it's a best endeavours test, and that may or may not be difficult to follow as time goes on. The employer needs to declare that they've taken active steps to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. I think that's probably a little bit less important now, because without doubt, there's not a lot of steps that we can take to mitigate going forward. The applications are done to MSD, but you do it via work and income. The application period started from the date of the announcement of the 17th of March for 12 weeks. I put this comment in here about considering the timing of when you might want to apply for this subsidy, because at the time we didn't know whether it was going to be taxable or tax-free. And what we've now learned is that the subsidy receipt is tax-free, and the other side of that, the flip side of that, is that the payment to the employee is non-deductible. So again, they offset each other. So timing doesn't become so much of an issue. But generally, most businesses who have 31 March balance dates will have a much better financial period of 30 March 2020 than they will to 31 March 2021. So getting income out of 1 year into another may have been appropriate, but given the tax-free nature, not quite so important. The government provided an example of this, which is probably a little bit dated now, because it talked about a tourism operator with 20 permanent part-timers and 40 casuals. The income was down 50%, forward bookings down 30%. So they released their casual workforce. So we then had 20 permanent part-timers at $350 a week, times 12 weeks, would give $84,000. Now the $150,000 cap is gone. It's the whole workforce that can be included there. There are a couple of fish hooks, I guess that's not the right word, but the requirements that you need to do. You need to get sign-off from your staff that they agree, and you need to provide details of your staff in the application, names, IID numbers, etc. The second piece, and this is probably a little bit less relevant now, is the leave and isolation support piece of assistance. And you can see from a dollars and cents perspective that is always intended to be the lesser part of the support package, because we're talking about $125 million as the amount that was budgeted for the cost. So just to run through it quickly, it's designed to support workers, employees, self-employed to self-isolate. The dollar values are exactly the same. So $580 for a full-timer, $350 for a part-timer. The employer and the employee could agree to use other paid leave, but they're not required to do so. And it wasn't available or isn't available if your employee can actually work from home and be normally paid. The employer applies for the leave on behalf of the employee. The MSD pays the employer fortnightly, and the employer passes that on in full to the employee. So employers versus employers, I've said, is the test only for those who are unable to work from home. And there's some pretty restrictive guidance around who this could apply to anyway, because they've got to be registered with Healthline in accordance with public health guidance. And the public health guidance covers two things. It's the return to New Zealand from overseas, and it's close contact to someone who has got a confirmed case of COVID-19. So that's reasonably narrow. And the second step part of it is if they're in self-isolation because they are ill with COVID-19 or they are caring for a dependent under those circumstances. If anyone travelled overseas from the date of the announcement, the 16th of March, they would know they wouldn't be eligible for this. So again, it's only available from the 17th of March. It's only for a 14-day period, and you would reapply at the end of that 14-day period. Again, as I've said, it's the wage subsidy which is the key area of support in government assistance. Here's a quick example that they gave us on the government provided. We've got John Smith, a full-time plumber, returned from overseas on the 17th of March. There was government imposed 14-day self-isolation, had no sick leave remaining. The employer applies for 2 weeks support, full-timer, 585 times 80, so 117,160, and then the employer passes that on to the employee. Some further government assistance measures that were announced. They announced depreciation on commercial buildings. They announced this to be a cost of 2.1 billion. Previously, we used to have depreciation rates on building at 4% diminishing value. That got changed to 0%. So now the proposal is to bring that back to 2%. As depreciation isn't a cash cost to the business, the flow-on effect is that it obviously reduces your taxable income and reduces your tax payments. There was a little bit of confusion as to what the start date would be, but I see now with some of the guidance that's been updated and it's been clarified that this would start from 1 April 2020 for the 2021 financial year. So we can look at commercial and industrial buildings to be depreciated at 2% from the next financial year. We've also changed some of the rules around deductibility for low value assets, budgeted to cost 667 million. So currently any fixed asset that you buy under $500 can be expensed. There's a temporary increase for the 2021 year that any asset under $5,000 can be expensed, and permanently from 2022, any asset under $1,000 can be expensed. So this is an encouragement for businesses to continue to spend. It's probably not particularly relevant as of right now, but perhaps coming out of COVID-19, we might be ready to start investing again in fixed assets. And if there's an encouragement to get a tax break for an asset under $5,000, certainly between now and the closing balance date of the 2021 year, there's an opportunity to do that. There were some changes to provisional tax, changing the threshold from $2,500 to $5,000, and this will apply to 2021 provisional tax. So no change to the fact that you've actually got to pay some tax. It's just when provisional tax kicks in. So it's purely a timing difference. So instead of paying your tax in instalments for tax amounts between $2,500 and $5,000, you now pay it in one lump sum on terminal tax date. So that applies from 2021. There was also provision for interest write-offs. So if you can't pay provisional tax, PAYE or GST that was due on 14 February 2020 or beyond, you can apply to IRD for an instalment arrangement to pay off that tax, and any interest and penalties would be wiped. There's still a little bit of uncertainty as to how that may come together, because under the current rules, applying for an instalment arrangement is time consuming, and if it's time consuming, it means it's costly, and it also means there's a whole lot of criteria to be met. I mean, we would anticipate that a lot of that would get waived, but until we've seen some legislation, we don't know that. And certainly around the Christchurch earthquake, IRD was quite lenient around some of those non-payments. So again, it's a cash flow issue, and I'll touch on cash flow a little bit later as well. And then the final bit of government assistance that was announced was with regard to income support. And again, I won't dwell on this too much, but there was an estimated cost of 2.8 billion from 1 April. All benefits, except for national superannuation, will rise by $25 a week. And I think there's also a wage index that gets added to that as well. The winter energy payment will double in 2020, so that's a temporary change. And there's a slight change to working for families and in-work tax credit. Won't dwell on that, but it does reduce the required hours test, and it does mean that there may be another $72.50 per week available to working for families. And again, some of this business support stuff is still a evolving situation. I understand that the Minister this afternoon is going to provide some further information, I guess, around some of the announcements that were made yesterday. And I guess that most of those announcements will be around the wage subsidy part of it. And clearly, basically all of yesterday's announcements were in relation to the wage subsidy. Okay, so the third part of what I want to talk about is some strategies about how you can deal with business interruption, recession, whatever you want to call it. And I guess some of these slides are a lot easier to deal with when you've got a slight change rather than a huge change in your position. So, but again, the strategies or the logic applies regardless. Research tells us that people respond generally tentatively initially when we get into a recession type situation, and then leave it for a while, and then later than they probably should overreact and do more than what they may have or should have done. So, you know, your tentative response tends to be a little bit of belt tightening, and you're living hopefully that things will change and you'll get out of this quickly. You'll see later on that you're not getting out of this as quickly as you thought or hoped, and you think, jeepers, we're in real trouble here. I need to make some really radical and drastic decisions. And then you do get out of it and you go, well, actually, those radical and drastic decisions, I've probably cut too many costs out of my business. I've let staff go. I've let some good experience go out of the business, and that now is coming back to bite. So there's a middle ground in there somewhere, and hindsight's always pretty good at telling you what this middle ground is. It's not so easy when you're right in the midst of it. Is this different to other recessions? And I think that's probably a question that Tony Alexander will address better than me. But you know, we do have stronger banks, we do have stronger fundamentals, we've got strong government support. So in many respects, the answer is yes. But we still have to get through this to see how it looks getting out on the other side. Some of the things you might want to consider, you know, what's the impact on your customer base, your direct customers, what's happening to them? Because what's happening to them impacts on what they can do with you. So it's a fairly obvious one, but you really do need to think about your customer base and understanding what is happening there and how that works for you. Falling asset values in your business, job security in the business, does that have an impact on short-term funding? The answer that we're hearing yesterday, and I think we'll hear more of today, is that the answer should be no. And there is strong directives to banks to be supportive, but that's no reason not to have a very open dialogue with your bankers and understand exactly where your position is. You want to understand what the impacts of things are on your business revenue, on your sales volumes. So what's going to happen with price, for example, if you get a 25% fall in sales and a 5% in price, what does that mean to your business? Are you better off having a 10% fall in sales and a 20% fall in price? Again, modelling this sort of stuff is pretty important to understand what the impacts will be and how you may be able to mitigate those and work out what the best approach is. I suspect in the current environment we're in, a lot of businesses will just be looking at getting whatever revenue they can through the door. It's about survival and paying the bills. What does it do to the balance sheet in recession times? If your asset values are falling or you need more debt, does that impact on your ability to raise funds and finance? You know, are you outside of your banking ratios and your banking requirements? Again, there will be support with this from bankers. Is there any good news in times like this? I guess, you know, some of the commodity prices are falling. So if you're heavily reliant on fuel in your business, at least there is that as a positive impact. And I guess if you're a strategic business and you're a long haul trucker or whatever, some of those falling diesel costs will help mitigate some of the issues that we're facing. What are others doing in your industry? You know, learn and collaborate. I mean, it's a time, I guess, for people to work together. And it's not just communities that work together, but it's business communities and everything that can get together, collaborate and share experiences and help each other out. And I think it's also important in times of difficulty to be clear and open with staff. I mean, staff are equally as involved in what's happening in the business as the owners are. So engaging with staff, I think, is pretty important. This is a bit of a busy slide, but some of the other things that you might want to think about going forward. And I think if there's any takeout that you want to take from this presentation, it is that first point on here that you've got to think about cash, and cash is king. I mean, that's again stating the obvious, but we need to be disciplined about cash management and cash projection. 3 months rolling position on a weekly basis, I think, is important for any business now. I mean, we should be sitting down and looking and going, what's going to happen to my business over the next 3 months on a weekly basis? How much cash is coming in? How much cash is going out? I've got the wages once a fortnight. I've got the PAYE on the 20th of the month. And I've got, you know, GST and other things. Put all of that in your forecast. Put your income in the forecast and then do some scenarios around that. It may not provide a pretty picture, but you're much better off doing that and understanding what things are going to look like than blindly hoping and carrying on and making some poor decisions. So the most important thing, as I say, take away, you need to project your cash position going forward. How much of your expenditure can be deferred? Looking for rental holidays. I've seen plenty of clients already looking for rent holidays, and that's very understandable. One of the bigger costs, and you can't pay it. How do you manage it? Also seen on the other side of the fence where we've got clients that own rental properties. How can they help and make that work? Because they've also got a business that they need to be able to continue with as well. Tax payments, we talked about tax payments before. There might be an opportunity to defer some tax payments. Looking at some of the other things quickly, looking at managing customer credit, segment your clients based on credit risk. There will be a tendency to try and grab as much revenue and make as many sales as you can, but they should still be viable sales. So marginal sales, is it worth the credit risk? Is it worth actually selling stuff, doing things that you're not going to get paid for, and still have to pay your costs? So that's a tricky one. You've got to manage your working capital. Without question, you've got to look at what you can do with regard to stock, how you can reduce it, but you've also got to be able to, if you're a producer, make sure you've got the stock to keep production going. You've got to make sure you've got your channels of supply in place and still be able to secure and source stock. You want to reduce your receivables by for sure, but managing credit, I mean, that's easier said than done. I mean, your best customer may be distressed, your best payer may be distressed. You're not going to give up on them because of that position. Have a look at what you can do with your financial structure. Reduce debt and liabilities where you need reserves or cash or savings or some other source to do this. Secure lines of credit. Talk to your bank. Can't say that often enough. The announcements yesterday, as I said, talking about the Reserve Bank, getting behind the banks and providing that comfort for banks. So I would see that that's going to be a very important thing to keep doing. Selling down fixed assets, again, easier said than done. Got logging contractor clients. They've got expensive, haulers and skidders, and they're worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, there's no market for them. So perhaps selling down non-essential luxury assets might be again something to consider, but there needs to be a market for them. Defer asset purchases. Put off what you can capital expenditure wise. Have you got leased assets that you might be able to do something with or get out of? Some of the revenue strategies, you want to protect your existing revenue, consider ways to get more from existing customers. You want to make sure you retain your customers, so think of some initiatives to be able to do that. Perhaps that's providing future benefits to keep them engaged and keep them along. Marketing spend is always a difficult one. Do you spend the same as you have been? Do you reduce your marketing spend? Do you look at marketing spend that is going to provide results now rather than long term? Do you think about your credit terms? Do you make them more generous? There's always a risk in that, but again, to make sales and generate revenue. Customers will shop more on price, so you need to be more competitive on a pricing basis. Can you do things differently? If you're renting equipment, can you do that hourly rather than daily? Can you unbundle your services if you're a service provider and provide part of your service rather than your whole service, and do that on a different pricing strategy? So what will the bold do? So the bold will look at investing in the future, and perhaps they'll be looking at research and development and product and service development, and perhaps there's time and opportunity to do that now. Perhaps they'll look at buying struggling businesses. Perhaps the bold will look at buying plant and equipment at distressed prices. Perhaps they'll look at taking on more staff. Perhaps there's an opportunity to be able to get qualified, experienced staff in industries where there has been a shortage before. Again, I suspect the emphasis is going to be more on retaining, working hard to retain your existing staff. Perhaps it's time to rethink your business model. Perhaps it's an opportunity to think of a change of direction in life. There's all sorts of things that people will do, the bold. So then, in summary, from a business strategy perspective, cash is king, as I've said. Do your rolling forecasting, manage your revenue as much as you can, reduce your costs as much as you can, consider CapEx as part of your costs. Staff are your biggest asset and also your costs. So again, if we look at the government assistance program, they are designed to look after staff and helping businesses, helping the economy, helping society, I guess, retain staff. Consider your financial structures, talk to your advisors, utilise the government assistance that's available, and again, talk to your advisors. I've got that on there twice, which makes sense. So that's pretty much the end of what I want to talk about, which I think is quite timely because I think we've got Tony Alexander ready to do the next piece. And I think at the end of this, we will have on our website, as will Anderson Lloyd on their website, have some contact details, because we want to talk to you. We want to talk to all people, that have issues. So, and to do that, please contact us at Paulson Higgs and Anderson Lloyd equally. I'll hand you over to David.
Thank you, Henry.
So this whole thing was originally structured as a seminar hence the people coming and going. So webinars aren't meant to run like that, but we'll see how we go. Now, our next speaker is Tony Alexandra, and this is going to test my technology no end. He is joining us from Wellington, basically on dial-up, which means we should be able to hear him, but we won't be able to see him. Where are we? Start. All right. Now, hopefully, Tony, can you hear us?
I can hear you okay. Can you hear me there, Dave? I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Excuse me, I'll just work through this.
I am here. I'm speaking. So let me know when that comes through. That's me.
Right.
Can you hear me?
I'm going to have a conversation with IT, believe it or not. Darlene, can you hear Tony from the broadcast? Can you?
I'm
Excellent.
speaking. Can you hear
Right,
me okay?
I'll leave the room and I'll leave it with Tony. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, David. And yes, apologies for the lack of any visuals here. I'm out in the countryside north of Wellington, and we can only get ADSL. We'll never have fibre, and used to get 5 to 10 MBS down the line there. And now, I don't know what, overload on network or someone put their digger through it. We're only getting 2 to 3. So hopefully this comes through okay, just audio only. Right, well, never in my life before, and I'd suggest the life of any other economist out there, have I had to make such rapid changes in what I see as the, yep, okay, just getting somebody's voice coming through there. Have I ever had to make such rapid changes in the outlook for the economy? Even just a week ago, we still, for instance, had 2 of the major media outlets there vigorously promoting domestic travel around New Zealand as a bit of an offset to the loss of international tourism. And of course, you know what, for 2-3 plus weeks, most of us have been focusing on simply that international tourism loss that provides employment directly and indirectly for about 165,000 people, maybe about 4.5% of our economy. And we were talking in terms of, well, there's also Kiwis travel overseas, and if they don't do that, that's $10 billion, which can be spent domestically. That's on hold, one would suggest, for 4 to 8 weeks, obviously. But clearly now, you know, we're looking at just the seizing up, I guess, the putting into suspended animation, hibernation of our economy for a period of between 4, maybe out towards 8 weeks. And what I want to do, I guess, is try and get to you an understanding about what it is the government's trying to achieve with its support policies here, working extremely closely, obviously, with the Reserve Bank, but with the banking sector as well. These are the 3 key pillars, I guess, underpinning the ability of yourselves out there in the business world to transfer so much of what you've got through time to when things are starting to get back, at least improving. Don't be thinking about normal coming back for a potentially long period of time. So I'll just run through, first of all, I suppose, some positive stuff in that we've actually entered this large downturn in our economy in very good shape in New Zealand. We have had our terms of trade, export prices versus import prices, at a record level at the end of last year. The greatest level of housing construction in New Zealand since 1974, increasing spending well overdue on the country's infrastructure, record low interest rates and no threat from inflation there. Wages growth was accelerating, so that's good for your household income. Business and consumer confidence levels were coming back up again in the second half of last year. And we also have had, and will continue to have in the future, underlying growth in a big, wide range of sectors. Often you and I will maybe only talk in terms of manufacturing or farming or construction, but there's a lot of this other stuff sort of going on for which we pretty much lack regular data. So it doesn't really necessarily get the sort of focus that it should. But included on that list of areas with strong underlying growth, the horticultural sector, your pip fruit, there, the wine industry, the space industry worth about $1.7 billion to our economy now, the film industry, movies and these sort of things, the games industry, so developing games for people to play online, something I guess quite popular at the moment. The IT sector, I think their exports are about $2.1 billion or something like that. The healthcare and the aged care sector, renewables growing strongly as well. So a lot of sort of underlying good long-term growth and focus for all of those sectors, which is still there and will be there when we emerge on the other side. Now, initially, we were all talking in terms of, well, here's the way in which what we see happening overseas hitting us. There was the inbound tourism hit, so not having the tourists traveling around the country, spending $17 billion per annum. Hospitality and entertainment sectors are sort of suffering along there increasingly with the social distancing. We talked about temporary interruptions, and I'm sticking with that, for the likes of manufacturing and construction, because of the absence of some imported inputs from China. Well, China's getting back up and running again. I'll come back to that later, and so those goods will eventually be coming through. Some sectors were getting hit by the but of course the big one now is that containment does work, that you can, by restricting the movement, the interchange of people, get the virus under control. And so what I wrote about, I think it was in last Thursday night's Tony's View weekly publication there, I invited people to have a look at the Chinese situation, where they closed down the city of Wuhan on January 23, and then the surrounding province of Hubei in January 24. And about 2 to 3 weeks later, the new number of infections per day peaked out. So there was still high numbers, but they weren't getting any higher, just as we're starting to hope might be happening in Italy, for instance, at the moment. But then as the new infections start falling away, it's only over the past 4 to 5 days that we've seen the number of new infections basically hit zero. You still see China reporting infections, but that's because of people coming back to the country. And my understanding is all of those people are going into quarantine anyway. And we see people in China starting to slowly take off their masks, coming back blinkingly into the streets there and out to the parks, and the factories getting back up and running. There's a very high percentage of factories back up and running now, although they're not at capacity. They've still got a ways to go to get the 300 million migrants who come from central and western China onto the eastern seaboard there to be working in all the factories. They must be up to about 60 or 70%, I'd say, of those people back by now. So when I look at that time frame, that's why in my commentary at the moment, I'm saying, here's our 4-week shutdown, which the government is moving us into tomorrow evening. But I would anticipate 8 weeks. I think 4 to 8 weeks is really what people should be thinking about with regard to this. And so here's where it gets interesting, because we are all used to having a certain reaction when we see forecasts or actual data showing a recession, big recession, whatever, in an economy. And it runs along the lines of, if I say to you, look, I think the economy is going to shrink by 1% or 3% or something like that, we all react negatively to that. We react negatively psychologically there because we know it means that many people are going to lose their jobs. Maybe it will be my job. I'll pull back on my spending because I'm worried I may not be able to service my debt. Maybe I keep my job, but I'm on reduced hours, no wage increase. We worry about that sort of thing. We know that some people won't be able to service their mortgages, and so you're going to get maybe mortgagee sales, forced weak sales of properties. Big falls in prices as can happen, in the farming sector when you get a decent plummeting like in a Warriors sort of a team score there at the end of the game, but it's because of the impact we know comes along of job losses, of business losses. So the government, in its policy response now, is not trying to stop the economy from shrink. Physical impossibility. Obviously, the fall in GDP over this coming quarter is going to be apocryphal. Don't look at the numbers, don't look at any projections. And I've noticed a few people out there who were doing some projections maybe are pulling back now. What the government's doing is not focusing on trying to stimulate the economy there. They're trying to do something, and keep up with me here. They're trying to act like Time Lords. They're trying to shift the economy through time, trying to freeze as much as what would normally happen when you see an economy go through a deep recession, trying to stop it and shift all of our economic activity to, maybe 2 months down the track, whatever, in the future. And so what their policies are focusing on, let's forestall the laying off of employees by providing the jobs subsidy. Let's forestall the loss of revenue for the individuals with the 2 weeks leave provision there. Let's forestall banks having to put businesses under or make them aggressively sell assets to raise cash by providing the banks with special assistance in order to keep businesses open, with ultimate, pretty much whatever backing they are going to need from the Reserve Bank. Let's forestall a big selling off in bond markets and in expectation of high debt funding pushing interest rates up, with again the Reserve Bank intervening to buy up to $30 billion of government securities, etc. Let's forestall the weak selling of houses, the mortgagee sales of houses, if not with an outright moratorium, but by working with the banks to ensure that they can carry these people through, either through a one-on-one sort of discussed the situation, or some overarching policy where people, if they audio connection restored. So I'm going to assume that I'm back up. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. That'll be my connection at this end. Better than dial-up, but not particularly flashy out here. So a lot of activity in the economy. It's not going to happen in the next wee while, and our focus simply has to be on carrying as many as possible of our valuable assets through to the other side without necessarily knowing when that other side is or what sort of economic environment we're going to find. But I guess I'll take a stab at that. Number one, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the international tourism sector is going to come back until sometime in 2021, and when it does, it will be much smaller, possibly on a long-term structural basis than we have seen so far. So that's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, once we get the lockdown period end, there might still be some initial restrictions with social distancing, etc. But once they are fully lifted, I'm going down the pub. I think the whole population is going to go down the pub, the restaurants and cafes. I can see a relatively strong bounce back on the hospitality sector, looking for bands to go and listen to, etc. Go back to the picture theatre. That sector, I think, can bounce back relatively strongly. It'll take a little bit longer, I think, for domestic tourism to pick up. You're talking about larger amounts of money for still scared individuals to be spending there than simply, as I say, going down to the local cafe or something like that. I fully expect that the manufacturing and construction sectors will be back up and running pretty quickly, as far as the availability of imported inputs from China, etc., will allow them to do. I think for those sectors that I ran through before, they will be up and running again in relatively, I guess, good time. Some of them, obviously, if people still aren't coming into the country, if this virus is still raging overseas, and frankly, that's the assumption I'm running on, given the mismanagement I see for many countries over there, our international borders, I don't think we should expect them to be open, quite frankly, again for this year. But I'm open to sort of anyone else having a better view on that. The farming sector, of course, they're still chugging along now, and one of the new developments, of course, around the world is increased worries about food security. So on the face of it, I'd suggest that this is a positive for the farming sector in New Zealand, especially now that they have increased availability of labour, maybe on a medium to long term basis. Obviously, some of the seasonal harvesting coordination is going to have to be undertaken there in the short term. But your likes of, your horticultural sector, etc. A lot of the products that they're shipping to that would be used in overseas restaurants, demand is going to be weak there. But hey, this is one of the things we've been saying for a number of years. We need to go up the quality ladder there in New Zealand into the consumer goods business. But of course, still the bulk of what we export overseas is just the bulk commodities, which is wanted. So it'll be interesting to see maybe a bit of a change in attitudes towards the farming sector. And I think Shane Jones has said New Zealand First will no longer back the passage of some water standards they were looking at bringing in light of the economy's now new increased reliance upon the primary sector as a percentage of our exports. Tourism isn't going to go back anywhere near to what it was for a long, long period of time, if potentially ever down the track. The interest rates outlook, well, interest rates are low, probably really not going to go any lower now, quite frankly, and they're going to stay low for a great number of years. It's very difficult to imagine situation coming back of inflation generally picking up there. We have the example in Australia of the Reserve Bank of Australia saying they're going to essentially keep their short-term interest rates down at 0.25% for out to 3 years. So you're looking at the low financing costs out there. And that, I guess, is one of the important sort of insulating factors for our economy. And initially, I would be reading through this list I'm going to do now in the context of our economy still functioning. Now it's more, this is relevant for when we start coming out the other side of this lockdown period. So the interest rates are low, debt servicing. For households, for instance, household debt servicing is only 7% of household income. That is back to where it was in about 1993, 1994. There was a peak of about 14.5% around 2008, 2009. We go into this without a debt boom. In the last 5 year period, household debt only grew 41%. It grew 84% in the 5 years going into the GFC. Business debt has grown 36% the past 5 years. It grew 86% in the 5 years into the GFC. The agricultural sector debt the past 5 years has grown 20%. That grew 111% going into the GFC. So, like, frankly, most of the rest of the world, we go into this with relatively low debt situation. Our banks are well capitalized. We haven't seen bad lending. The books look relatively good. The profits certainly have been high. I think the government and Reserve Bank will have full expectation of preparedness by the banks to forsake all of their profit in the next wee while in order to help out the economy, etc. The Reserve Bank will simply put whatever lines of credit are needed in place to make sure as much credit as possible flows going forward. The government has major fiscal policy headroom. So the Finance Minister, he used that term when he announced the initial stimulus support package, $12.1 billion last year, of come May 14, it will be a recovery budget. That's good terminology, because by then I think the focus in New Zealand will be on the recovery of our economy from clearly what we're going through at the moment. That's when stimulatory policy to extend over the next 12 months or so will become relevant. It's completely irrelevant and pointless giving everybody extra money at the moment because you can't spend it anyway. What's the point? We have underlying labour shortages in a range of industries: farming, construction, forestry, horticulture, etc. And this is where I guess it's sort of, I invite you to form your own opinion on this one. Australia has 1.5 million people on temporary work visas in the Australian economy. We have about 200,000, 154,000 were issued in the past 12 months, temporary work visas. Our economies have become heavily dependent upon foreign labour. That is going to act as a cushion for our labour markets degradation over the remainder of this year. Now, for the moment, I guess these people will be staying in the country, maybe given some assistance where possible, but when it comes to businesses hiring again, of course, they will have to give preference to Kiwis. So I think once we see them, maybe some more flights, etc., being available down the track, these people here on temporary work visas, I would imagine most of them, unless they have a high level of skills, will be leaving the country, and it will lead to a structural change in our labour force away from that high dependency upon the foreign labour for a period of time we can't figure out at the moment. Oil prices have gone down, so that's a good thing. Lots of houses need to be built. Well, of course, not any are going to be built in the next 1 to 2 months, but that'll just worsen the shortage, sort of. That's a bit hard to figure out. Infrastructure spending, Kiwi dollars going down. The $10 billion you and I were going to spend this year on a trip to the GC, Fiji, Hawaii, or whatever, we're not going to be doing that. China takes about 30% of everything we export from New Zealand. China is getting back up and running again. The Chinese Communist Party wants their economy, their society to be looking as normal as possible, as quickly as possible. They will be wanting to reopen the restaurants, etc., as quickly as is safely able to be done so. They'll want their people to see they have good food supplies, etc., still running through. I have no doubt there will continue to be good demand for New Zealand's food products coming out of China for an extended period, of time. As regards the fall in the share prices out there, matters a lot overseas, not so much in New Zealand. Certainly if some young people were going to use their KiwiSaver funds for a house deposit, well, they should have had it in the conservative scheme. If they had it in aggressive, well, they won't be making their purchase for the next wee while. We don't debt fund our share purchases in New Zealand. We have low equity ownership overall. And what was the other thing I was just going to say? No, I've already mentioned it on the underlying strong growth in a great range of sectors out there. So we have some insulating factors, but they will not stop the cessation of our economy over the next 4 to 8 weeks, and for other economies around the world going through the same process. The best we can do is try and carry as many people, jobs, actual positions, and businesses through to the other side. And maybe I can just back up what the previous speaker, sorry, don't you know your name there, was saying in regard to take this as an opportunity to have a look at your businesses and what you're doing. My theme in all my talks, presentations for the past 2 years has been there is about a 3-year period of weeding out coming for our economy, and it would be across all sectors. And I said my weeding out is going to be on the basis of an absence of the boom in some sectors from 2014 to 2018. Tourist spending grew 70%, 70% over a 4 to 5 year period. What we've seen, of course, is a lot of businesses have lost their pricing power because of the ability of consumers to easily find alternatives online. Your model needs to adjust to reflect that, focus on most profitable products, locations, clients, etc. I've spoken about the low availability of labour, and that obviously is going to ease a bit in the future, so not quite so relevant. That'll come back again in 2 to 3 years' time. The social licence for businesses has been challenged. People are looking for businesses to address climate change issues, but on the back burner at the moment. We're all making a contribution there, and use of plastics, etc. So an opportunity to have a look at those issues, which will come in back and forth. You can just bet there's a lot of peed off greenies out there at the moment who may be happy about the air traffic and industrial pollution, etc., falling away, but probably not happy about not getting quite so much attention as was the case previously. So those social pressures are still going to be there. And here is also another one to consider. All stops are being pulled out at the moment to make sure that credit is available to anybody who needs it for the home mortgage, for business financing purposes going through into the future. My warning for the past 2 years has been credit availability in New Zealand has structurally declined. I've already given evidence of that in those debt growth numbers I read out just earlier on. The banks in New Zealand and Australia, they had a banking super cycle and it finished in 2008. It's hard to imagine anything other than after this, people will be newly wary of debt. The banks will eventually, in the medium term, tighten up even further their lending criteria. The credit will be available, but the terms will be even tighter than any of us, I would suggest, were thinking 4, 8, 12 weeks, 12 months ago. It won't be a rigorous imposing by the banks. They won't be doing it through this crisis period, but it is something for the longer term. And that just means when businesses are looking at expanding, they have to give extra thought to financing more of that expansion through their retained earnings when earnings come back again over the next 2 to 3 years. And through getting outside capital and not relying on the banking sector as much as was previously the case. I haven't given any single number there at all on where I see the unemployment rate going, where I see GDP going. That's because there's no economic model which is able to say, this is what we've observed usually happens when there is a pandemic. Let alone, this is what usually happens when you close down your economy for 4 to 8 weeks. We simply don't know. And so those of us with any sense are copying what the Reserve Bank governor did last week, and that is say, this is not about forecasting. He didn't give any forecast. This isn't about forecasting. It is about working with our people, with our bank, with the government assistance schemes in order to get as many of our assets through to the other side and then rebuild on the other side, because this is going to be, I would suggest, it's the worst economic downturn we will have ever seen since the 1930s. And with any luck, it's the worst economic downturn any of us will in fact ever see in our working lives. So David, I've sort of finished saying there. I haven't given great specificity on exactly what environment you're going to face in the very near future. We know exactly, all of us, what it is for the next 4 weeks, and I would suggest allow for out to 8 weeks. And beyond that, it is going to be a focus on recovery with an absence of those international tourists, 4.5% of our economy for an extended period of time, but with domestic travel slowly picking up, manufacturing and construction getting back going again as well. Oh, maybe, sorry, just one quick thing there on the housing market. Well, nothing happens. It just freezes up. There may still be some transactions, but there will be so few, you won't get any price gauge come out of this. I do think that longer term, New Zealand will come out of this looking pretty good, so that will bolster the long-term net migration flows. But for the moment, we're not receiving that population boost because you're not getting people sort of going across the borders, as was the case previously. You're getting Airbnb houses being put on the market now, so there's a wee bit of downward pressure on prices when the market starts functioning again from that. But we went in with a listing shortage. You'll have a whole generation of people now learnt what the baby boomers learnt in October 1987, the danger of having a lot of your wealth in shares. And I think it will reinforce the newer generation a desire to invest in property and maybe a bit less in shares over time as well. Nobody has just woken up at any stage in the past month to discover the price of their property has gone down by 30%, as has happened in the share market. The regions, hard to figure out what happens there. There's a plus for the regions here in that telecommuting is going to become more possible. Maybe some people engage with a simpler life and will shift to the regions, versus the regions have become highly dependent upon the tourism sector over the past 5 years. And so there's an economic hit to come from there. And also when the economy is weak, people seek jobs in the cities. So I firmly believe we're going to see some decent price falls, no idea what magnitude, in your prime tourism locations around New Zealand. The regions, I think, overall will tend not to fare as well as the cities where the populations are based, where businesses are based, etc. Going forward. But it's sort of be fairly silly not to forecast that generally I'd expect prices to fall for a while. I don't think it's going to be sustained, but it may take a wee while for the prices to recover coming out the other side. I'm going to knock it on the head there. If you want more information, I'm obviously writing quite a bit on all of this. I have a website, tonyalexander.nz. You'll find my 2, I think, email addresses that I've got there. If you want my weekly Tony's View publication each Thursday night, just email us from there. And I've also been releasing so far 3 2-page COVID-19 supplements, trying to put a shape in people's head about what the nature of this sort of looks like. I'll do another one, I guess, in a few days' time, but overall, yeah, putting out quite a bit of material on that. So I'm going to knock it on the head now. I've got another thing to go on to in exactly 3 minutes' time. Thank you very much for having us there. And David, I guess I'm passing back across to yourself now. I'll just verify that. You're there, Dave.
Thank you, Tony. I'll take it from here, such as it is. So,
all right, signing out. Thank you.
That brings the whole presentation to an end. I'll thank all the speakers, especially impressed with some of the stuff we've heard. And I thought Sarah's effort was pretty tremendous, all things considered. Tony had some positive news in there that he thinks the economy is going to be stronger and better at the end of it. And the reality is, I think it will be. So look, thank you very much for your time and attendance. There will be a recording made available shortly that will go out to you. We'll send you copies of the slides if you haven't got them. So the last thing is, remember the government website, covid19.gov.nz. If you need a hand, if you've got any questions, feel free to contact Paulson Higgs or Anderson Lloyd, and we'll do what we can. We're at home, but we're still working, and we still want to help you, because that's what we do. So stay safe, and yeah, we'll see you on the other side of all this. Have a great day.